I remember that night like it was yesterday. My friends and I had decided to spend the night in an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, a place notorious for its dark history and frequent paranormal activity. The building had been a mental institution back in the early 1900s, but it was shut down after a string of mysterious deaths among patients. The stories of mistreatment, torture, and cruel experiments on the mentally ill had always lingered, and many believed the place was haunted by the tormented souls who never found peace. We arrived just before midnight, armed with our EVP recorder, infrared cameras, and flashlights. The air was heavy, and the silence of the surrounding woods made it feel like the world had stopped turning. As we approached the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The once grand building now stood in ruins, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. The stories about this place were enough to make anyone uneasy, but we were determined to capture evidence of the paranormal. Once inside, we split up to cover more ground. I took the east wing, where the most disturbing stories originated. This section had been where the most violent patients were kept, often in isolation. As I walked down the darkened hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. The smell of decay hung in the air, and the peeling paint on the walls seemed to pulsate with an eerie life of its own. I set up my infrared camera in one of the rooms that still had restraints on the bed. As the camera began recording, I turned on the EVP recorder and asked the usual questions. "Is anyone here? Can you tell me your name?" But the silence was deafening. After a few minutes, I decided to move on, but just as I reached the doorway, the EVP recorder picked up something. It was faint but unmistakable, a whisper. I played it back, and my blood ran cold. The voice, distorted and crackling, said, "Help me." Shivers ran down my spine, but I pressed on, curiosity overpowering my fear. I continued down the hallway, passing by rooms with rusted beds and cracked mirrors. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of dread became. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, and then it went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled to turn it back on, and when I did, I caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure standing motionless, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence emanating from it. Gathering my courage, I aimed my flashlight at it, but in that split second, it vanished. The hallway was empty again, but the fear remained, clawing at my insides. I backed away slowly, making my way to the staircase that led to the basement, the part of the asylum where the worst of the atrocities had taken place. I knew I shouldn't go down there alone, but something compelled me to continue. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath came out in white puffs. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. The walls were lined with old, rusted medical equipment, and the floor was littered with debris. I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance, but it was the oppressive silence that unnerved me the most. I set up another infrared camera at the far end of the basement, near what looked like an old operating table. The EVP recorder was still on, and I asked once again, "Is anyone here? What happened to you?" For a long moment there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then a low, guttural voice came through, barely audible but filled with rage. "Get out!" My blood turned to ice. This was no plea for help. This was a warning. I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt like lead. Just as I was about to turn and run, I heard something behind me. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, circling me, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was down here with me wasn't visible. Panic set in, and I bolted for the stairs, the footsteps still echoing in my ears. As I reached the top, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I was trapped, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whatever was in this asylum didn't want me to leave. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually I forced myself to push open the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. I ran back to the main entrance, my heart pounding in my ears, and burst through the doors into the night. My friends were already outside, their faces pale with fear. They had heard the commotion and had come running, but they were too scared to go inside. We didn't say a word as we packed up our equipment and left the asylum behind, the sense of dread still clinging to us like a dark cloud. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that asylum, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left undisturbed, and whatever spirits haunt those crumbling walls, they are not at rest. We agreed to never speak of that night again, but the asylum seemed to cling to me like a shadow. Sleep became elusive, haunted by the images and sounds from that night. The whispers, the shadowy figure, and the footsteps that never stopped. Weeks passed, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if something from the asylum had followed me home. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, I decided to review the footage we had captured that night. My heart raced as I clicked through the files, each video bringing back the fear I had tried so hard to forget. Most of the footage was as I remembered it: dark hallways, eerie silence, and the unsettling EVP recordings. But then I found something I hadn't noticed before. In the video taken in the basement, just as the footsteps started, the infrared camera picked up a faint outline. At first, it was barely visible, just a blurry figure in the background. But as the video progressed, the figure became clearer, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, dressed in what looked like a patient's gown. He was standing right behind me. I paused the video, my breath catching in my throat. How had I not seen him? My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but deep down, I knew there was no explanation. This was something beyond the physical world, something that defied logic. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. But then, just before I ran for the stairs in the video, the figure's head slowly turned to face the camera. It was as if he knew he was being watched, and he wanted to make sure I knew it too. I shut off the computer, my hands trembling. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, just like it had in the asylum. I could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond my sight. My phone buzzed on the table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a message from one of my friends who had been there that night. The message was short, but it sent chills down my spine. "Have you watched the footage? There's something else." Before I could respond, there was a loud crash from the hallway outside my living room. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked slowly to the hallway, every step echoing in the silence. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. The picture frame I had hung on the wall was shattered on the floor. But it wasn't the broken glass that terrified me. It was the fact that the frame had been nailed securely to the wall. There was no reason for it to fall. My phone buzzed again, this time with a video attachment. My friend had found something even more disturbing in his footage. With shaking hands, I opened the video. It showed the east wing, where I had felt the strongest presence. As the camera panned across the room, there was a loud, unearthly scream, a scream that didn't belong to any of us. The camera shook, and then something impossible happened. The door to the room, which had been locked shut, slowly opened on its own. The video cut off abruptly after that, leaving me with more questions than answers. I knew then that whatever had been in that asylum wasn't confined to its walls. It had followed us, latched onto us like a parasite. And now it was here, in my home, watching, waiting. I tried to sleep that night, but every sound, every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a cold breeze. My bedroom window was open even though I knew I had closed it. And there, in the reflection of the glass, was the faint outline of a figure standing at the foot of my bed. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. Just the lingering fear that something was terribly, terribly wrong. I knew I couldn't stay here, couldn't risk whatever this was getting stronger. I packed a bag and left my apartment, not caring where I went as long as it was far away. But as I drove through the empty streets, the sense of being followed never left. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that hollow-eyed figure sitting in the back seat. I don't know how this ends, or if it ever will. But one thing is certain. What we encountered in that asylum wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker, something that feeds on fear. And now, it's out in the world, searching for its next victim. I just hope it's not you.